Hello folks, welcome back to another Kubernetes video. Today I will be talking about authorization on a high level, some of the different authorization modes that we have in Kubernetes. In future videos I will go into some of those in more detail, but this video will look to give us an overview of Kubernetes authorization. So let's begin. We discussed previously about authentication, which allowed us to verify the identity of a user when they try to access our cluster. Authorization allows us to dictate what the user can then do once they have access to the cluster. We can restrict the types of operations that are performed. We can restrict the objects that they are performed on and the namespaces in which they are performed. So now let's quickly look at a few different types of authorization. The first one is node authorization, and this authorizes API requests made by kubelets. So it's a specialized type of authorization built specifically for the interaction between kubelets and nodes. And it's used to report information about nodes. So the kubelet will be authorized to read information about the node, and then that information will be written back to the API server and updated in terms of the node object. So the node authorizer is used when the group is set to system nodes and the name of the user is prefixed with system node. The next type of authorization is ABAC, attribute-based access control. And with this type of authorization, we associate users or groups with permissions. We specify the permissions in a JSON file, and this is the format of the JSON file. So we have a policy object, and we specify the user, the namespace, the resource, and the API group. So the API group in this case, in a prior video we discussed how APIs are grouped into different sets of APIs. I'll run over this again when we talk about Airbag in detail, but just understand here that we might have groups for things like apps that will include, deployments, replica sets, and different components like that. And when we want to use ABAC, we set the flag authorization policy file to a file name that we have created all of our policies within. So we also have to set the option of ABAC, and these are options that are passed to the API server itself. However, the problem with this method of authorization is that if we want to go and make changes to the permissions that we've given to a user or group, then we have to modify the file manually and restart the API server. So obviously it's not a very maintainable method of setting up our permissions for users, which is why we have Airbag, which is role-based access control. So with Airbag, we create a role for a specific set of users. For example, developers. We associate the user with that role, and if a change is needed, we simply modify the role, and there is no requirement for a restart of the API server or anything like that, because the roles and role bindings are part of the Kubernetes API. And just to quickly illustrate how this would work via this diagram, so we set up a role, and that will specify what we can do and on what resources can we do it. Then the role binding will connect a user or a group of users or multiple individual users if we want to this particular role, and then these users will obtain the permissions that have been specified within the role. Another method that we can use is a webhook. So this essentially will give the responsibility of providing the permissions of a user to a third party. So it outsources the authorization. So essentially what we'll do is we'll get our request from the user, we'll know the user's identity, then we'll send a request on to our webhook, which will send a response back to us and say, okay, this user can do X, Y, and Z. And then based on that, we either allow the request or deny the request. So one example, which is quite popular, is Open Policy Agent. So as I was saying, we will send the user and the requested resource or operation to OPA, and then OPA decides to allow or deny the request. So wrapping up, there are 2 additional authorization modes that we can use. These are always allow or always deny, I guess kind of self-explanatory in terms of what they do. It is in the name. And when we are setting up the Kube API server, we have to pass this authorization mode option to the API server in order to determine the method of authorization or methods of authorization that we're going to use. So we can use any combination of these methods that I have outlined in this video. We just have to specify this authorization mode flag when we are running the Kube API server. So I hope that was useful. We will be going into Airbag in the next video, so stay tuned for that. If you have any questions, please leave a comment, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.